All right, let's talk about the lymphatic system of the human body. Now, the first thing we should probably say is that most people talk about the immune system and the lymphatic system in the same breath. These two systems are really one and the same. And when we think of the immune system, we think of white blood cells. We think of those cells that wander our human body fighting infection. Immune system is primarily cellular, and so it functions throughout the human body that way. But white blood cells spend a good deal of their time, in fact most of their time, in the structures of the lymphatic system. And the lymphatic system then are the gross structures, or the tubes and the passageways and nodes and various structures that are found throughout the human body, and where you find most of the white blood cells in the body. So this is the immune system and the lymphatic system. We're going to focus on the lymphatic system here to a great extent. We'll mention a few things about white blood cells, but not too much. And you'll be dealing with white blood cells and how they do fight infection when you get to your physiology class. In talking about the lymphatic system, there aren't a lot of structures. Let's go through them just briefly. There's the thymus gland, which many people don't know, but we found the one in the cat dissection this semester. We've also found the spleen. The spleen is considered part of the lymphatic system. There are lymphatic vessels all throughout the body, usually called lymphatic ducts. And you can see in the picture here all those green tubes, and of course many, many more than what you see there. Here and there, scattered all over the body, are lymph nodes, small, rounded, tiny organs of lymphatic tissue that are important, and bone marrow, which is, of course, where all of the white blood cells originate from, down in the deep within the bones of the human body. Now, as we talk about these various parts, they have many, many different tasks or things to do. But let's talk about their primary task for most of this. The lymphatic system's major purpose is to return tissue fluid into circulation, or recirculate it. Now, we haven't talked about tissue fluid, but there is fluid that bathes all of the cells and tissues in your human body that's constantly being produced, or really just leaking from the capillaries throughout the human body. Plasma is constantly getting out of the capillaries within all tissues. And it's really forced out both by blood pressure, because there is a good deal of pressure in the capillaries, and they're very thin-walled, and especially the fenestrated capillaries or sinusoidal, fluid is going to leak out dramatically. But there's also an osmotic pressure, and this goes back to something that we said early on in this maintenance unit, that the protein differential between the blood and the cells causes some water to leave the capillaries and to move out into the tissue spaces. And so both of these provide a regular and fresh supply of fluid into the tissues. And so plasma becomes tissue fluid. And that constant bathing with fresh fluid is, of course, good for the cells. Things don't stagnate there. And the cells always have fresh fluids and substances coming out of the tissue. Now, one little interesting characteristic here, a little wordplay here, is that tissue fluid in the past was also called lymph. Okay? And so that's where we get the word lymphatic system, because it's really describing this fluid that we find flowing in the lymphatic vessels. This is, in fact, the fluid that you see in a blister. If you've ever had something rub against your skin so much that a little bubble of fluid developed underneath the surface of your skin, that is lymph or tissue fluid. Likely the epidermis and the connective tissue layer came apart and fluid began to collect in those spaces. Let's picture this for a moment, how the capillaries and the fluid and the lymphatic system are all related. And that's what you see in this picture. Here you see an arteriole, you see a venule, you see the little capillaries running between them, you see the little cells, but you also see here embedded within it a number of tiny, tiny little tubes. And that tissue fluid has to find a way to return to general circulation. Well, it can't do it right here because the pressure is moving the fluid out of the capillaries and into the tissue spaces. So something else has to catch that fluid and get it back into general circulation. And that is going to be little tiny lymphatic capillaries. Just as simple as the capillaries of the cardiovascular system. Gaps between the cells, and fluid that accumulates here can make its way into these lymphatic capillaries. Notice they're not connected to anything. They're sort of a dead end right here in the tissue spaces. Fluid, the plasma in the cardiovascular system, flows from one tube into another tube. It's the excess fluid that flows out of the capillaries that makes its way into these very, very porous lymphatic capillaries. And these capillaries are found in almost every tissue. There are just very, very few tissues that do not have lymphatic capillaries and ducts. And this is one of those parts of the human body that not too many people are familiar with. Basically, wherever there are capillaries, there are going to be lymphatic capillaries as well. So just to sort of summarize it here, excess fluid from the tissues, and you see the capillary down below, high pressure blood, low pressure blood, right? It's going to produce excess plasma, we call tissue fluid. It's going to bathe the cells and then be caught by the lymphatic vessels. Edema can occur if the fluid doesn't enter these capillaries. If for one reason or another the lymphatic capillaries were blocked, you could have an excess amount of fluid in the tissues, as you see in this picture where the person's left leg is very, very much larger than the right. And that is just excess tissue fluid. Now, there are any number of reasons why that could occur, but it could be a blockage in the lymphatic capillaries that is doing this. So, now all of these little lymphatic capillaries and all of these tissues then begin to join together, and the little capillaries and the tubes get bigger and bigger, and we begin to call these lymphatic ducts. And that's basically what you see illustrated in this picture, is the green tubes that become larger and larger are carrying more and more tissue fluid from all the many tissues in the human body. And there is a problem here, though, because the fluid can contain other kinds of debris, especially if you've been injured. If you have a wound and it opens capillaries, it's going to open lymphatic capillaries and maybe even lymphatic ducts. And fluid that is there and any other debris, if microorganisms get into the wound, if there are dead and dying cells, those can make their way into lymphatic capillaries. The clotting process closes up the capillaries and any blood vessels that were broken by a wound, but lymphatic capillaries can take in that debris. And so tissue fluid can contain bacteria and viruses and other sorts of debris from any sort of wound and the sort of microbial war that is going on in a wound. by the entrance of bacteria or viruses. And that could follow these tubes and get back into general circulation. So all of these tubes are going to lead back to the cardiovascular system. And let's look at that. The lymphatic system in many ways is like the systemic veins of the human body. Systemic veins are returning blood from the capillaries to the heart. And this, of course, is deoxygenated blood. The same way lymphatic ducts are returning that excess tissue fluid to the plasma of the cardiovascular system. The tissue fluid comes from the plasma, and it's going to return to the plasma. So the lymphatic system is returning fluid to general circulation. And we'll see this a little bit later as well. Now, we were talking just a moment ago, too, about how the tissue fluid can have debris in it. And so what happens is the lymphatic system is built with some security checkpoints. The lymph nodes are basically places where the tissue fluid is going to enter from any number of lymphatic ducts. And you see here, there are many, many ways in, but only one way out of this lymph node. The lymph node is full of white blood cells. Many, many white blood cells are here. And if infection comes into this lymph node, many, many more white blood cells will come, and even many, many white blood cells will be multiplied into this space. And sometimes lymph nodes swell and become extra large in places where there's infection. And basically the fluid flows into here. It makes its way through all of the tissues. The white blood cells act on it. And so it really is a security checkpoint where the body is checking this fluid that's going to go back to general circulation and is trying to purify it. And you can see that in that lymph node, the fluid that is flowing out is now going to be in a purified state. And if you look at the placement of lymph nodes, they're in very, very critical places. The lymph nodes are clustered around your groin and your armpits. And in the diagram here, you can see all of those lymph nodes down near the groin. And that, of course, is going to mean that there are major purification sites where your limb tissues enter your torso or your body. And so all the fluid flowing back from an arm or all of the fluid flowing back from the leg may have been through a couple of lymph nodes in the limb, but at the juncture between that limb and the body, there are clustered many, many lymph nodes. And so along with that, there are going to be many, many lymph nodes throughout the torso, especially in places that form entrances to the human body. Now, you already know, we've already talked about the digestive system and the respiratory system as being entrances into our human body. And because they are, bacteria, viruses, other kinds of things can get into our human bodies, can get deep within us, coming through those passageways. And so this material needs to be dealt with. And so the respiratory and the digestive system see lots and lots of lymph nodes associated with them. And so this tissue fluid coming back from all the tissues of the human body is collected and collected and collected. It's run through many, many lymph nodes. And so it becomes more and more purified until it's ready to re-enter the cardiovascular system. And here's where it's going to re-enter. There are two major tubes that everything is collected in. Two major lymphatic ducts. And you can see it's way up here in the upper reaches of the thoracic cavity. On the left side, there is a very large tube that's coming from the abdominal cavity called the thoracic duct. And over on the right side, is a smaller tube known as the right lymphatic duct. Let's take a little bit closer look at where these two lymphatic ducts are joining the cardiovascular system. Okay, and they're entering right here at the Brachiocephalic veins. Now, we just got through dissecting this last week in the cat. I'm wondering if you can follow along and see and name these veins right here. Do you remember the two that are pointing upward there? That's right. Those are the jugular veins. And the ones coming from the side that were coming from the shoulder area were called the subclavian veins. Where the subclavian and the jugulars meet, they form a larger tube, and that, of course, is the brachiocephalic veins. And there's a right and left one of each of these. And then when the brachiocephalic veins come together, they form that one large tube that we call the superior vena cava. So, you can see at each juncture, right where the jugular and the subclavian come together, right at the beginning of the brachiocephalic, there is the right lymphatic duct coming in and the thoracic duct on the left-hand side. You see a couple of smaller tubes in there too, but these are the major ones. And this is how all of that tissue fluid that's been collected from the entire human body becomes plasma again, right here in those upper areas of the thoracic cavity. And there's even going to be a draw as that fluid, under normal conditions, in our daily standing posture, fluid is making its way down into the heart. And so there's going to be a natural draw on that lymphatic fluid, that tissue fluid, and pulling it into the body. Now, what's interesting here too is that these two tubes, the thoracic duct and the right lymphatic duct, don't each collect 50% of the fluid from the body. Here's a diagram that shows you how the fluid is managed. You can see that the right side of the body, only the right arm, shoulder, the right side of the torso, and the right side of the head are collected from the right lymphatic duct. The entire lower part of the body, including both lower limbs, the entire left side of the torso, left arm, left shoulder, left head, those are all collected through the thoracic duct. So the fluid is not collected 50-50. It's got that uneven collection that you see right there. So we have followed now tissue fluid from every tissue in the human body back through lymphatic capillaries, lymphatic ducts, purified through lymph nodes to these two huge ducts. And now that tissue fluid becomes plasma one more time. Okay? You can diagram that whole circulation kind of like this. Take a moment and really look at this picture. You might want to begin by following your way through the cardiovascular system. You can see the right side of the heart in blue. Pulmonary circulation is there on your upper right-hand side. And so you can see the pulmonary trunk and its tubes going out, and the capillaries there would represent both lungs, not just one. You can see the oxygenated blood back to the left-hand side, and you can follow systemic circulation through the aorta there, leaving. And they didn't diagram in every single blood vessel. That's okay. But we can see there at the bottom of the picture systemic capillaries, and then the deoxygenated blood returning back through the vena cava to the right-hand side. And again, it doesn't show both vena cava, but I think you can follow that sequence there. We can see in both places where capillaries are represented, both pulmonary and systemic, you can see that there are lymphatic capillaries there. Every tissue basically in the human body. And now that fluid is flowing back through various tubes. You can see lymph nodes in the midst of it. Follow the arrows, and the lymphatic fluid, the tissue fluid, is flowing back and is going to re-enter the venous system and become plasma one more time. Now let me point out one other structural characteristic that's very important, and another thing that makes me think these are just like veins. In fact, see how they parallel the venous system here in the picture. But lymphatic ducts have valves in them, almost exactly like the veins of the human body. Valve-like structures that keep the tissue fluid moving in one direction. Of course, there's not a lot of pressure here. It's just that pressure of fluid that builds up in the tissues that causes the flow and keeps the fluid moving through the tissue. And like the veins of the human body, the general movement of your human body and the pressure push on tissues is going to help move that fluid along. And the combination of weak tubes that can be compressed by body tissues and the presence of valves make these tubes function almost like veins. They're not as big as most of the veins in the human body, but it's the same principle that is causing the fluid to recirculate and to come back into the venous system and become part of general circulation. Now this whole picture can be illustrated in kind of a negative way. There's a tropical disease that can illustrate the problem in the body if the lymphatic system isn't working. And it is kind of gross. It's called elephantiasis. And it's illustrated here in this unfortunate person who was infected by what are called nematode worms. There's a small worm only found in tropical areas because these little worms can exist in the ground in moist places. They're so small, they're microscopic, that they can make their way into a person's body tissues through any little break or crack or whatever. And they worm their way into the lymphatic tubes. And of course, there's tissue fluid there that contains a residual amount of nutrient that's coming from the capillaries, oxygen from the capillaries, and that fluid can nourish these little worms, and they can crawl, and as they get bigger and bigger, they can plug up the lymphatic ducts in a tissue. As you see here, this right leg is enormous, and because it has sort of the look of a large elephant, the stump-like lump of an elephant's foot, it's been called elephantiasis. What you see there is edema. What you see there is extreme edema, where the fluid has just expanded and expanded and expanded the tissues of that limb. And once it stretches to this point, it can't be reversed. Early on in the stages of the disease, there are drugs that you can take that'll kill the worms, and so no damage will occur. But in a person that is not treated, this can happen, and it can happen just about anywhere in the body. It's most common to see it in the lower limb, where the site of infection can occur. But I've seen pictures of it in the upper limb, in the torso, and in many other places. So it's an unfortunate problem, but illustrates the problem of lymphatic circulation. If tissue fluid can't recirculate, then it will just begin to make tissues swell. So this is the picture of lymphatic circulation. Okay? All right. Now, just a couple of other things. Let's go back to the fact that there are any number of organs. This diagram in your textbook shows nicely a number of ways that the cardiovascular system, the lymphatic system, interact. These upper two items here are that recirculation of tissue fluid. One One special place where there's a special fluid is in the digestive system. And the lower part of those two pictures that you see there is the small intestine. And special lipid type molecules that are absorbed in digestion find their way into lymphatic vessels called lacteals. And the fatty materials that we're absorbing begin to recirculate in that way through tissue fluid in the digestive system. If we go down this picture, you'll see the spleen is indicated here, and I think you all know where the spleen is now. The two diagrams here show its placement to the left-hand side and posterior to the stomach. Major blood vessels lead in and out of the spleen. The spleen does a couple of things. It's full of white blood cells, and this is a major recycling point for red blood cells. You remember red blood cells. As they near the end of their lives, they become a little bit of stiff. They don't fit through the capillaries very well. As they flow through the spleen, some fibrous tissue in there begin to break them apart when they're not so resilient. And the white blood cells, remember, one of their major tasks is cleanup in the human body. So the spleen is all about digesting old red blood cells and recycling them. Because there's lots of white blood cells, it's a major site of cleaning up any infection that might occur in the blood. And so the spleen is very, very useful. And even white blood cells are produced here. So there's a number of lymphatic functions that take place here in the spleen. Also, we see here bone marrow, and of course, it's interesting in each of these areas, like the spleen has an arterial blood supply into it, the thymus gland and other tissues do. But white blood cells don't circulate into bone marrow, they are produced in bone marrow. All the white blood cells are produced deep in the bones of the human body. And the precursor cells from here, some of them develop right there in the bone marrow. Those cells become what are called B cells, the letter B as in boy, for the fact that the cells mature in the bone marrow. But in the bone marrow, there are also some little immature T cells that are produced. Those T cells go out into general circulation, and they find their way into the thymus gland. And I think you remember a little bit about the thymus gland. We saw the one in the cat. The one in the human being sits in exactly the same place, superior to the heart. It's got two large lobes in the human, and the T cells, and you're going to hear a lot about B cells and T cells when you get to physiology, but the little immature T cells find their way to the thymus gland. And of course, that's why they're called T cells, because they mature in the thymus gland. I told you this is kind of like the elementary school for white blood cells. Well, they're for the white blood cells of the T type. And this is where they grow up. This is where they learn what they're going to do as a white blood cell. And from here, they then migrate out into the human body. The thymus gland grows quite a bit in your first year of life, and is big and robust in the child, and degenerates later in life as it's done its job in preparing T cells to fight infection in your human body. And when you think about B cells and T cells, just the general rule of thumb is the B cells are the ones involved in producing chemicals within the human body called antibodies that help fight infection, whereas the T cells are more involved in fighting cellular battles and fighting infections that occur inside of cells. They fight diseased cells and cells that have joined the other side that are forming tumors in your body. So B cells mature in bone marrow, T cells mature here in the thymus gland. And so these are the basic organs, and this parallel sort of semi-venous circulating system that returns tissue fluid from all the human body to the cardiovascular system. So that picture that you just saw and this one are really the two that help you visualize what the lymphatic tissues are all about. So keep those organs in mind and keep these tubes in mind that recirculate tissue fluid, and you'll have an excellent concept then and an understanding of the lymphatic system. Okay? That's it.